Hi everyone. In this wrap-up video, I just wanted to take a few minutes to talk about my own theoretical journeys over time, um, and really to prompt you all to think maybe in some novel ways about how different theories of reading and literacy and teaching and learning might be impacting your own work in the future. So I'm actually going to, this is going to be very personal in the sense that I'm going to be talking about my own family, and I'm going to be talking about my great grandmother, who was a theorist and a practitioner. She was an educator and a philosopher a very, very long time ago. So, again, the idea here is to just really talk about theoretical journeys over time. So, my great grandmother's name was Pearl Hunter, and then that became Pearl Hunter Weber when she married. So, this is one of my favorite quotes of hers. She wrote in 1922 in an article in the Educational Review. She wrote, "All knowledge, all thinking really worthy of the name, ends in reaction, implicit or explicit. Only so can knowledge be power. Knowledge that is all ready to eventuate in reaction is powerful, but it is not yet power. It comes to the same thing to say that the final stage in any complete act of knowledge is application, which is the true climax of intellect." So she wrote this in 1922, which, if you go back and look at some of the years in which a lot of the seminal and foundational behaviorist theory was written, it was done in the early 20th century. My great grandmother, Pearl, or Granny, as I like to call her, um, graduated Phi Beta Kappa. She was the first woman to graduate Phi Beta Kappa from the University of Chicago in 1899. And then she continued on to get a master's degree, and she actually, in philosophy, and she actually worked with John Dewey, which is kind of cool, to say the least. And then she went on to do what I think, I don't know how she did it. She was a woman in academia at a time when she couldn't even vote, and at a time when she had four children, and then on again off again marriage. And honestly, I don't know how she did it. She went on and became the chair of the philosophy department at the University of Nebraska Omaha. Actually, at the time it was called Omaha Municipal University. And she was the chair of the philosophy department for about 20 years, although she was never allowed to make more than half of what men made. Um, she was a very powerful influence on my life. She died when I was only about 4 or 5 years old. Um, and I actually dedicated my book to her. Um, and you'll see that in the at the very, very beginning. Um, this quote of hers, I love, because to me it spans so much in the way of theories that we have read about and discussed this semester. We've talked about this whole notion of reactions, stimuli, and response. She was not a behaviorist. In fact, she wrote very powerfully against behaviorism, and I think I even quoted her in the inset discussion in chapter, oh, I think it was in chapter 3 when I was talking about cognitive constructivism. Um, and but you can still see some of the terminology of the time, that notion of knowledge that is all ready to eventuate in reaction, right? Um, and yet at the same time, I mean, you see almost this push toward a recognition of power and relations of power, and that's something that is really addressed most robustly in the theories in chapter 5, right, in critical and incoherence theories. um, and then what I think I like about this quote as well is that it really emphasizes practice and application. And for me, that's what happens in the classroom. And I'm sort of hoping that throughout this semester, um, I've I've scaffolded some of our understandings regarding those connections between theory and practice as well as research. And I think that this quote here of Granny's, this idea that power is in and intellect is in application, not just a theory that sits on the shelf. I think that's one of the things that's particularly powerful to me about this quote. Um, so you have some different photos here of Granny through time. She went to the University of Chicago. She taught at Muncie Normal Institute. She taught at Illinois Women's College in Jacksonville. She taught at Southwestern Kansas University in Winfield. She taught at University of Nebraska, Omaha. This is and actually, a lot of those places she taught are emblematic of where women academics were often pushed into. They were pushed into normal institutes, aka teachers' colleges, and women's universities. So even though she didn't go into her graduate work planning to be a teacher educator, that was sort of one of the only ways in for women at that stage. So I guess you could say that teaching and teacher education really run deep in my blood, as obviously does theory and that theory practice bridge. You can see Granny holding my dad in 1943. That's when he was born. And then down here, you see her holding me in 1969. She died in, I think, 72 or 73. So it must have been when I was 3 or 4 years old. But I remember her. One of the things that I remember about Granny is that she would always wear her Phi Beta Kappa key, particularly if there were special occasions. And you can see her here, and you can see it around her neck right there. It's a little gold Phi Beta Kappa key. And she wore it whenever she went to the dinner table, and she wore it any special occasions. I don't know what occasion this was in which this photo was taken. But I'd like you to notice this is also the photo on the back of the book for this class. And this is me, and I'm wearing her Phi Beta Kappa key. One of the things that I've become very aware of in my own work is how theories live and morph through time, and how in many ways the more I come to know and come to learn about teaching and learning about myself and about theory is how there's so much folding over time where these theories sort of emerge and go away and then come back in a different way, maybe in a different context or a different application. And I think the quote that on the previous slide actually shows that how many different theories can come to life in practice as the true climax of intellect. And so I view a lot of my own work as, in some ways, as bringing Granny to life. In my current work, um, I have been, and I may have talked about this some during the semester, but I work a lot with Patricia Valente, who you've read about in the book, and you can see her here. This is a picture of her teaching in her classroom several years ago. And then these other photos are artifacts of some work with her students over time, over the last several years. Um, and one of the things that I have been particularly interested in trying to understand um, is the intersection between practices and classroom practices um, and language and learning, and in particular, how teachers and students negotiate power relationships and their own identities, social and academic identities, um, through literacy learning. I'm particularly interested in reading comprehension and literature discussion and inquiry. Um, and so that's one of the projects that we've been working on. Um, when I first started this work, I'd looked at theories of identity, and I've always sort of situated myself along the lines of both critical and incoherence theories, in particular critical sociocultural theory, and also sociocultural historical theory. I've really been moving a lot into critical race theories. Um, um, and so that's also something that's been very important to me. Lately, in this work, I've been doing a lot of reading about, and along with Dr. Crumpler, we've been writing about a theory which I haven't really, or theoretical construct, which I haven't talked about in this class. It's not even in the book. And actually, if I get to write a second edition of the book, I'd like to stuff it in there. Um, but it's a notion of what's called scaling and scaling practices, and it's related to sociolinguistic theory. In fact, some people call this concept sociolinguistic scales. And what's meant by that is really the notion that through our language, including our language varieties, um, and just sort of the subtle ways that we choose to use language in the classroom, we're positioning ourselves and other people in particular ways. And as we do that, our language may go to what's called a higher or more power laden scale. So, one example of a scale that we might think of would be like standardization. It's something that is sort of, it's a very dominant framework or ideology. And something in the way it operates seems to make it very difficult to argue against. And so it seems to be very global or almost timeless in scale. And then there are other ideologies or scales that might be considered more local and contextualized, sometimes more fleeting, um, and a little bit harder to maintain and practice. And those might be things such as authentic assessments and ideologies of student-centered instruction. Um, One of the things that I really appreciate about Patricia Valente's instruction is that I think she's very adept at navigating those different scales in her work and recruiting the language or discourses of one scale and moving it into another, maybe as a way to justify doing, maybe even taking a discourse of standardization, but using it to justify doing something completely outside of the box. So this whole notion of sociolinguistic scales and scaling practices is something I've been playing with. And um, if you're interested in learning more about that, I've included in the unit on ReggieNet for you some different references and citations where you can go read some of that work. I've also included a PDF of one of my great grandmother's articles that she wrote on behaviorism and indirect responses, in which she sort of lambasts John B. Watson's view of behaviorism. And I love it. She just sort of comes off as a little bit of a badass in that paper. And so it's just something that I go back to and read every now and then just to, fill my soul a little bit. um, and so those resources are there for you. And I guess with all of this in mind, I just really want to end by turning the lens away from me and my work and really onto you. And so as you move out of this course, I really want you to be thinking about, where are you headed in terms of your practices. And what I mean by practices, it could be your classroom practices, it could be your research practices or other inquiry practices, it could be both, or it could be something different. But I think that for me, one of the things that keeps me going, and that keeps my memory of Granny alive, and that I think keeps theory alive, and keeps theory meaningful, is practice. And Practice always means change. It means being able to adapt to what happens to be going on in your classroom in a given week, in a given month, in a given year, in a given second, and how you respond to your students. And so I guess my hope for you, uh, as um, as you leave this course, is that you take the time to step back and ask, how might the things you do in your classroom be done differently? How do they bring theories to life? How might your practices be, in effect, re envisioning certain theories so that there's something other than they are or were for the people who designed those theories? How might these theories change who you are as a teacher, and what you do in your daily practice? I know theories are constantly changing me, and as I go, I hope that my practices of theory and research are constantly changing theory as well. So, with that, I'm going to sign off. It's been a lovely semester. I hope that this has been both challenging and enjoyable for you. Enjoy your summer. Bye bye.